Hello and welcome to the very first episode of The Check-In. I'm Paul Chappell. It's really great for you to join me this evening. We're going to try and make a bit of a series of this. We've got some great talent lined up, not just tonight, but across the next few weeks. So really encourage you to check in every Sunday, Tuesday and Thursday night from 8 p.m. Where we'll have a bit of a chat with some really interesting people with interesting views in this very interesting time. I hope you're all doing okay. It takes a lot of getting used to. This was meant to be a studio show. It was meant to have 10 crew, all the bells and whistles. It's just me in my front room with a new software package. I hope this is going to work. So bear with me if things are a little bit dodgy for the first one or two episodes. You know that I'm doing me best. That's what we can only do during COVID-19. So just very quickly, the check-in, it's really about conversations, and I really welcome you to be involved. For every show, if you've got a comment or a question, either for myself or for the guest that we have on the show, please feel free to use the comments down below, and we'll try and get to as many of those questions and comments as we can during the show. Hopefully each week my guest will stay on and answer some questions on Facebook afterwards if they can. So really, it's all about us coming together. This is only every sort of second day because I don't think we need to do this every day. I know there's a glut of news and information coming at us all the time. If you like, you can turn it all off, just check into the check-in every second day, and things will be nice and rosy. Now, tonight we've got a fantastic guest, Bill Bowtell A.O. Bill is a renowned specialist in infections and disease. He comes to us from University of New South Wales, and Bill will be coming up in a few minutes' time. So make sure you stick around and ask Bill as many questions as you can. I'll try and keep a watch on all those questions coming in. To the news. So we'll update you during each episode with a quick rundown of what's happening at the moment around the world. Just looking globally to begin with, there's just over 1.2 million cases, almost 65,000 deaths, and around 247,000 recoveries from that, which is great news. The active cases at the moment, over 891,000. 95% of those are mild, which is what we want to hear. 5% are severe or critical, and the closed cases, which is a pretty medical sounding term, 311,000. 79% have recovered and have been discharged, which is great news. 21% of those closed cases resulted in a death. Looking locally here in Australia, the total cases, this is information that I pulled off the net about an hour ago, so it's pretty fresh. Total confirmed cases, 5,688 in Australia, 34 deaths. The recovered cases, 822 of the active cases, which are almost 5,000. You'll see that New South Wales is just under half of all of those cases. Obviously, the population is greater in New South Wales, and we have had probably the most number of ships trying to dock in our harbour, which is its own issue. And we've found out today from the Chief Police Commissioner that there will be an official investigation into the Ruby Princess. So we'll see what comes of that. Moving along with just some interesting information that I saw around the number of cases and tests. In New South Wales, tests are up today by 3,800. and it's returning a 2.1% positive result from that. If we look at Tasmania, Western Australia, and Victoria, they're the other states over 2%. So they are on the higher side. Also looking at ICU beds, and I just found this interesting in terms of the number of ICU beds available in each state and how many cases there are. So in New South Wales, 874 ICU beds. There's over 2,000 in Australia all up. So we will keep our eyes on those numbers, and hopefully, given the way that the trends are happening right now, I kind of feel like Anthony Green on election night here, but looking at those numbers, hopefully we're starting to see a trend downwards, or at least flattening. In the confirmed cases, if we look at this graph, hopefully you can see it okay on your screen. What we see here is basically the trend in terms of how COVID-19 doubles in Australia. And this is an interesting graph when you compare it to the next one, which is the global graph, where we see Australia is starting to flatten a little bit, the black line. We see China, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Taiwan have already crossed that mark of doubles every week. So we really want to try and get to that faint grey line on the right-hand side as quickly as we can. Now, during the week, Sydney University, the Centre for Complex Systems, I don't think I'd ever get a job there. This is hard enough for me, just running this show. But in short, the Centre for Complex Systems has released a lot of incredible data this week. They've been doing a lot of complex testing, obviously. And a quote from them: in short, the best intervention approach identified by ACEMOD, their system, is to combine restrictions on international arrivals, which we already have done, a case isolation, which we've also done, but we can do a little bit more of, and social distancing with at least 80 to 90% compliance over a period of 91 days. So that's 13 weeks. We are in it for the long haul, but that is the data from Sydney University. So essentially, we have to be locked down for that amount of time, but they're also saying that that's not the end of it. We still need to maintain, at that point, social distancing so that we can actually keep this in measure. So a lot of information there. Essentially, they've provided a nice little graph there. If we're at 90% social distancing, i.e. staying at home, it'll be a 3-month picture. If it's 70% or less, then basically we can't control COVID-19 in the community, which is obviously not where we want to be. So that is basically the update for now. Hopefully I didn't race through that too quickly and you got a bit of a head spin. But there's a lot of information there. Obviously, we can be looking at it all day, but hopefully that's enough for now to provide you with up-to-date information. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Bill Bowtell to the check-in. Bill, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you.
Pleasure, Paul.
So, Bill, a little bit about your history. We've had a couple of conversations, but you had an interesting start as a diplomat in Portugal, Rhodesia, and Papua New Guinea. How long were you doing that for?
I was there about 7 or 8 years. And then when the Hawke government was elected in 1983, in March of that year, Dr. Neil Blewett, who became health minister, whom I'd met actually in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, asked me to join his staff as what was called then principal private secretary, like the chief of staff of his office. Right. And Neil had been asked, of course, to implement the Medicare national health insurance system. So we had a very big job in a very small office to look after Medicare, but at the very same time, within weeks of Neil becoming health minister, we'd had the first cases of what then became known as HIV/AIDS reported in Sydney. So we got two big jobs within a couple of weeks of each other from 1983 onwards.
So that must have been a very busy time for you.
Busy doesn't describe it. Getting Medicare up and running after there'd been an enormous political fight about it that had stretched back to 1969 and been part of what happened in 1975 in the dismissal and so on and so forth. And then the Fraser government had 5 health schemes in 7 years, and Labor was very, very adamant under Bob Hawke's leadership that Medicare would be introduced as it was in September 83, and it was up and ready to go on the 1st of February 84. So Dr. Blewett and his office were charged with the immense amount of work required to get it in, but also to register the Australian population for health insurance and circulate cards and all that sort of thing. It was an immense undertaking, really.
So that all sort of happened at the same time. Medicare, you must have been told to get your skates on once Hawke had won government, and you had to implement this very quickly. And then, as you said, the first case of AIDS arrived in Australia or was reported. How were you able to literally juggle those two? Was there a conflict of interest at all in terms of where you spent most of your time? Or
no, the first case of what wasn't then known as HIV and AIDS was reported by the great Professor Ron Penny. A patient came to see him in Sydney, October 82. And to remember, the science was very, shall we say, not advanced at that stage. And it went on for weeks and months. Nobody knew what was causing this disease. We didn't know that it was a virus. And it took a long time for the top scientists in the world to figure that out. But we had this increasing caseload from late 82, and then the Hawke government, Dr. Blewett, came to government in 83, and it was a mystery. Quickly asked the people at the time what was going on. I will remember one of the top medical people in Australia looked at him and said, well, whatever it is, Minister, you can be sure it's not a virus. Well, it turned out to be a virus, and then really rampantly ran through Australia and, of course, in the rest of the world over 83 and 84. It created immense dramas, but I'm very happy to say that Dr. Blewett and Bob Hawke, supported by Andrew Peacock, the leader of the opposition, they made a very critical decision, and they said it would be a national responsibility, and the response would be put together by the federal government, who would then work with the states and territories and all the affected communities and so on to bring some sort of order to the chaos that was enveloping us at the time.
It's an interesting parallel that we have playing out at the moment, I guess, with Australia introducing universal healthcare back in the 80s. The Trump administration and many other administrations in the US have really rallied against it for a long time. Obama tried and failed. What do you think is going to happen now with this pandemic? Do you think it's going to change the conversation, the narrative around universal healthcare in the US?
Oh, well, it has to. I mean, America has a health sector, but not a health system, not a health, a health system like the NHS. The health sector, get this, is about 17% of their GDP. That's an enormous figure. Every country in the comparable OECD countries brings in their health system, as we do, at about 10% of GDP. And our life expectancies are much greater than the United States. Of course, there's universal coverage. Every single health indicator and outcome in the countries that have universal health insurance and national health systems are much better than the United States. So they spend an immense amount of money in the United States. They have 30 million people uninsured, and their health outcomes are poorer. And the consequences of not having that robust health system in the United States, which was dismantled, or never really got going, but it was certainly dismantled, any aspects of it in the last several years, are now cataclysmic. Cataclysmic. People who want tests in some parts of the United States for COVID are being charged $800–900. There aren't the ventilators. There isn't the equipment. It's a shocking indictment of lack of planning, but also immense waste of money. The difference between 10% of GDP and 16% in the United States, the entire Pentagon budget is 4% of GDP. So what goes into the pockets of the insurers, the health funds, the hospitals, all the people who stand between the money and the patients and the people who desperately need healthcare is an unimaginably large figure, all wasted, all for nothing.
Yeah. You once said that you totally agreed with your former boss, Paul Keating, that good policy requires guts and imagination. Is that what you and the team, as an architect of the Medicare system, is that what you had? Is that why Australia really led the world, I guess, in terms of the response to HIV/AIDS? In being able to act quickly and to communicate effectively?
Look, the great guts and imagination for Medicare came from Mr. Whitlam when he was Prime Minister, and then Bill Hayden, and then the great architects of that were John Deeble and Dick Scotton, two great academics, and they pushed and prodded and shoved, and then Dr. Blewett and the Hawke government finally got it over the line. And it was fought at from election by election by election, all the way through, it has to be said, till 1996 when Mr. Howard became Prime Minister, but on the condition that he kept Medicare very wisely. So it was a long and bitter fight, and those giants made it. When it came to HIV, we were just extremely fortunate, coincidentally, that we had the health insurance system up and running at the same time, and that greatly strengthened the ability of people who were ill to be at least cared for. We didn't have any treatments, and for the money to flow easily from the federal to the state governments for hospital inpatient, for hospice care, and for the distribution of such treatments and medicines as we could have at the time, and then to look after all of the other research and treatment aspects of it. So we were very fortunate that if we had to have the problem of HIV and AIDS, that we had Medicare to be the structure with which we could deal with it.
Josh Whiteman, a guy I might be rather familiar with, being my business partner. Thanks, Josh, for getting on board tonight. He was asking, Bill, what your thoughts are in terms of, after this pandemic, for the Australian healthcare system, private versus public. What do you see happening in that instance?
Well, I think it's very interesting. It's not nationalisation.
No.
Have not interacted really, but in this crisis, I'm very happy to say that a workable solution was found by the federal government and the private hospital operators, and working through the states to ensure that the available capacity was there if we needed it for COVID people, and also for all of the other intensive care problems that just don't go up every day. People break a leg or have a heart attack or need urgent treatment, and those people have to be looked after too. So we've seen some very big changes. Where that goes to and what happens will be one of the very big new things we'll have to deal with when we come to the other side of this thing.
Yes, this thing. Now, Bill, you've been rather critical of Morrison and the federal government. You've been on Four Corners, 7:30 Report, Current Affair. You're popping up all over the place, and of course, you were begging to be on the check-in. But well, maybe. But what's your main beef, Bill, with ScoMo, head of marketing? What hasn't happened? I mean, if we look back and the question I asked you before about guts and imagination, which you have plenty of during Medicare and HIV/AIDS response, what's not happening now?
Look, I think you can put it in one word. There was a failure of imagination. The committees came together and were called together in January when it was really clear that we were facing a very serious problem from China and around the world. The virus was starting to spread around the world. So at least from January, it was absolutely predictable what we would face in Australia very shortly. And of course, viruses come out of nature all the time. It's nothing new to have a viral assault on any country. 40 years ago with HIV and AIDS, and then we had SARS and MERS and so on, Ebola. All of these things have been there. So
Have we lost Bill there? It seems like we may have lost Bill, I think. Yes, I think we have. It might have dropped out. I'll try and get Bill back on the line, but I wanted to read something that Bill wrote back in 2008. And it's quite prophetic, actually. He writes, this was an essay that he was writing about HIV/AIDS. He writes, imagine it. Some 50,000 young Australians suddenly struck down and killed by a new virus. 140,000 more infected and kept alive only with complex, expensive and painful therapies. The outlook is grim. The caseload increases exponentially. Hospitals are at breaking point. The economy has stalled and a generation has been decimated. The authorities and the public are confused and overwhelmed. Great timing, Bill. Bill, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you see me?
Yes, I think we can. Yes, there you are. Sorry, the line just dropped out. I was just reading your introduction to the Griffith Review essay back in 2008, where you basically predicted what we're going through right now, but this was obviously in response to HIV/AIDS. You talk about the economy being stalled. You talk about hospitals just being completely overloaded. And this was a hypothesis that you were putting forward, but this is the reality today. Could you ever have imagined that this might have been the case?
Sure, because we had the same problem beginning with HIV and AIDS, and we were at the wrong side of what looked like an exponential growth curve in cases in Australia. And it's all very well in retrospect to see what didn't happen. But we were very, very apprehensive that as 84, 5, 6 went on, we could see this spreading, particularly through injecting drug use and sexual behaviours into the general population. And that was happening in other places in the world. And it particularly happened, in fact, in the United States. And that would have made a tremendous impact on our hospital system and our care system because, as I said, we had no treatment. There was no outpatient way in which we could treat people with HIV. So we took really bold and resolute action in 86, 7 to really contain it to the communities at first affected, and more or less we kept it there, and until we had treatments in the late 90s, which then changed it from a lethal infection to a manageable disease. So I'd seen that, and I'd seen what could go on, and I'd seen how wrong it had gone in the rest of the world. So I had a fair respect for viruses. You know, they only obey the laws of chemistry, physics, and biology. You can't plead with them. You can't negotiate with them. They don't take the bad and only the bad and not the good. You know, all of this stuff that was around in the time of AIDS. A great respect for nature, the understanding it could come out of the blue at any time, and of course, I'm a pipsqueak compared to Bill Gates. I mean, he had a great TED talk, you can see, that he gave in 2015, and he spelled it out completely clearly. And you know, he's understood this all the way along, and it's a great pity that the American administration, not the Obama administration, but the Trump people, had this great man there who could see it all, and just somehow ignored it, thought it could never happen to them. Well, it has, and it did.
It seems like that intersection of politics and pandemics has been around for a long time. And in that Griffith Review essay that you wrote, you did talk about how America basically turned what was a controllable virus into a pandemic because of the way that it acted, or didn't act. That's a really interesting sort of dynamic. I guess how politics can actually play a really big role in the outcome of a pandemic like we're in right now. Um, what your thoughts on that?
Well, viruses come from nature, but the response is made by men and women, by humans, by governments. And the governments that do best when these things turn up are the ones who don't have partisan politics. They don't seek to make cheap political points. The politicians fund everything, they convene everything, but then get out of the way and allow the real experts to give the health advice that's necessary. They don't second guess them. They don't overrule them. They don't try to pretend that there's any easy way out of the problem. And that's what we did in Australia. As I said, Bob Hawke and Andrew Peacock were great. They said it's a one national response and we're out of it. We're not going to be in front of it. We'll fund it. We'll do everything behind the scenes. And in Australia, we had a tremendous cross-party agreement in the Parliament. There was never a political debate or brawling about it. And they had to do very difficult things. You know, they had to talk about sex and drugs and sex work and things that in those days weren't mentioned in polite society, much less on television. And it worked. And I saw how well it worked. And in due course, as things improved and we saw that we had a world-leading response, I and many others were very happy to pay full tribute to the work of the politicians of all parties, and Bob and Andrew and Neil Blewett, of course, and Peter Boehm and Paul Keating, Don Grimes, many people who worked tirelessly to keep the show on the road, but didn't want to be up front. It won't come as a surprise to you. I mean, if you take a prime minister of the day, half the people voted for the prime minister and half the people didn't. And they're not the right, as an office, it's not the right office to do the front work, I think, in responding to these very difficult situations.
There's been questions asked as to the transparency of the government, the stockpiling, the PPE gear that we meant to have warehouses full of. We still don't know where those warehouses are or what they're full of. Sounds like it might be a bit of BS, but you asked that question on Q&A and there wasn't a very satisfactory answer from the government. Are you expecting, they're talking about releasing the modelling this week, hopefully some more information about the availability of all this equipment. Do you see that forthcoming this week, or just another ruse by the government?
Well, the core word in the response to AIDS was trust and openness and transparency. Nothing was secret. We looked to the community to generate the policies that we then implemented. In this case, the key word is secrecy. Meetings of these committees took place in secret. The modelling was secret. The fact of the strategy that they developed based on herd immunity principles imported from the UK, that was secret. It wasn't taken to the Parliament or the people or the press. Nobody knew. And many, very unfortunate things happened. No surveillance at the airports, no real stockpiling of quantities of test kits and PPE and so on, and no public information campaign that ought to have taken place at least from the beginning of February to alert the Australian population about what was inevitably coming. We saw the consequences of that play out sometime about the middle of March, when this whole thing was dumped really on the vast majority of the Australian population, who I won't say had no clue it was coming, but clearly the majority of people were very relaxed or unknowledgeable about the drama that was about to unfold. And we saw the lamentable situation of the Prime Minister blaming people on Bondi Beach for not listening to the stern injunctions to socially isolate. Well, those kids had never seen anything about it. They don't read the paper or watch television news or listen to press conferences. And there was nothing. There was no conditioning of the Australian people to get them along the journey to say we might have to do very strange and tough things very soon for these reasons. So a lot of things that ought to have happened in January, February just didn't. And those figures you put up tonight, I mean, it's great. Every averted infection is great, but we should be a lot lower down on the graph towards Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong than we are.
I think that's the Prime Minister calling. He'd be watching this and he'd want to have a word with you. Bill, we're talking. I run a creative agency with my business partner Josh Whiteman. We spend every day working on communications campaigns. Everyone has their opinion about the comms around this pandemic. Little animation videos coming up on our video screens every night. Very cute, but it doesn't seem to be really cutting the mustard from an awareness and people actually having any comprehension of what's happening. There's a lot of confusion. I'm conscious of the time. We could talk all night, but I did promise the audience from their feedback that we'd try and keep this to 20 minutes, half an hour. I want to go back to the 80s because you were involved in briefing what is perhaps one of the most amazing TV commercials that Australia has ever created with Simon Reynolds. And I talk, of course, about the Grim Reaper TV commercial. Talk us through how this happened. We're playing it on screen. I hope all the kids have gone to bed because I almost played it to my 5-year-old today. Daddy, what's that? Nothing. Took it off the screen very quickly. Tell us about that experience, because this was a piece of communication in Australia that changed the way that society spoke about the issue.
Yeah. Look, it became very apparent as the situation became very serious in 84, 5 and 6 that we needed to alert the general population about the need to change risky behaviours, because we had no treatment, nothing, so that if they got sick, we couldn't save them. And to do that, we had to basically take a piece of 4x2 to the Australian population and say a very big bad thing could happen if you don't change your behaviours, and therefore by seeking the information that we will provide to you. Now, the Grim Reaper was the visual side of that, but it was at the top of a pyramid of an immense amount of printed information. in all the community languages and very graphic and frank. It went out in Reader's Digest inserts. It went to 6.5 million Australian households. It just flooded the nation, but we had to get their attention. Now, it was a lot easier to do in those days because there were, 4 commercial networks in the ABC, I think, and SBS, and that was it. So we put it to air in April, and it did stop the nation. It was something that had never been seen before. The effects were real. A set was created, and the bowling alley was built. It wasn't CGI in those days, but it really did just rivet the attention of the nation. They went to get the information. We had tests by that stage, so many, many people came in to get tests who probably weren't greatly at risk of HIV infection, but it did give us a tremendously important baseline of information. But it took us a year or two of getting everything in order so that it went seamlessly when the ad went to air. And it's an interesting thing. We only ever paid the Commonwealth Government 4 weeks and then 2 weeks, 6 weeks paid. And people would come up for years afterwards saying, how could you spend all that money on that ad? But the visuals were so compelling, and so people thought they'd seen it every day for years.
Yeah.
And so it really achieved a tremendous amount. And Ita Buttrose, now chair of the ABC, was the head of NACAIDS and was responsible on the committee for getting it up and getting it through. But it was tremendously successful for the time. There's a lot of controversy. I accept that people have different views now, but I can tell you at the time we needed all the money we could to deal with it, and we desperately needed people to change behaviours. And around that time, but accelerated after the Grim Reaper, the new caseload infections started to fall away dramatically, and that did not happen in the United States of America or many other comparable countries. And from that point on, we deviated tremendously from comparable countries. So we came in the end about 10% of the HIV infections and AIDS deaths per capita in Australia that they did in the US, and that was tens of thousands of young Australians who never got HIV infection and, of course, and never died from AIDS.
Wow. I mean, the numbers and the efficacy of that campaign speaks for itself, and a huge congratulations. I know it spun Simon Reynolds off into the nether regions of stardom and fame.
He was a great visual creator, and we gave him the brief, and he came back with he and his colleagues then came back with this just arresting imagery, which I liked because it combined, when I briefed him, Japanese manga with the compelling picture of death, the Grim Reaper playing with the knight in Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, which I had loved as a child, and that had always stuck with me. So Ingmar Bergman is one of the inspirations for that ad.
Wow. Good to know. I've got to ask though, Bill. I mean, with an ad like that, surely there was some interesting feedback. I mean, when you presented it to Dr. Blewett and to the PM at the time, what did they say? Did they comment?
Well, we never presented it to Mr. Hawke. This was how far removed, properly and detached he had made himself from what was going on. He said, you go and do it. You take the consequences, I guess, but you go and do it. And if you think it's necessary, that's fine with me. And I don't think Bob ever saw it before it went to air. Very few people did. It went to air, I think, on the Sunday night, and I think on the Friday night in Sydney, that was the first time that Dr. Blewett had seen it. It had been put together by the committees that were charged with doing the communications.
Hang on, are you talking about politicians leaving it to the experts?
Politicians left it to the experts.
Wow.
And it wasn't just empty words, it was the fact. And We researched it. We understood it. We knew what was required. We knew it had to be bold and radical. It had to get the attention, and it had to be visual, and it had to go to young people at that time. But effectively, we had to get the permission of the Australian people to do all of these things that seemed unfathomable just a few months and weeks and years before. So they left it to the experts, and that was the same on the science side. I remember in Dr. Blewett's office, the head of the science committee that was dealing with the facts of AIDS, the scientific facts going out to the medical community and so on, we would only ever learn what the head of that committee would say when the press release came in, or we watched it on television. There was no control. There was no need to control. It was all open and above board and honest. And we said, or they said what they knew, and they said what they didn't know, and they kept on issuing new guidance and new guidelines in accordance with the scientific facts as they became available. That was the way to do it. That was always the way to do it, and that was not the way it was done this year, with the lamentable confusion, lamentable crossing of wires, the changing of advice, the all of the things that we've seen, and that really culminated in mid-March, really, in Australia, where the Grand Prix was on and then it was off, and the football was on and then it was off, and then social distancing was this and that, and 500 metres. That was only just under 3 weeks ago that we were in the middle of that terrible confusion. Now, things have got better since then, I absolutely agree, but it's been a tremendous amount of work. We've had the debate and discussion at a very high level with a lot of storm and fury in the last few weeks that honestly we all ought to have had in January and figured it all out then, and then just got on with the job of protecting the borders, educating the people, stockpiling the equipment, and hunkering down for what came. It's deeply confusing to me and very disappointing that all the lessons we learnt then just went by the by when we were getting ready to confront this thing, which is truthfully really the equivalent of at least of what happened with HIV in the world. I mean, HIV in the end has delivered 25 million people dead. Now, thankfully, very few of those were in Australia, but it was because we worked at it to make sure that we didn't get that share of people. But 5 million dead, it's a big figure. And that's what can happen if you make a mess of the response, which we did with HIV and AIDS in the world. And I hope, honestly, really, that the world doesn't make a similar mess of this, because it's new. For people who are sick, who are in hospital, we don't know what the long-term effects are on the lungs, on the heart, on the brain. It's not the cold, it's not influenza, it's new to science. And I just don't want us to be in the position where we find out as a scientific experiment how far and wide it can roam, and what happens to people, of course, terribly, who might die, but also the people who recover. What's their long-term prospects? I just wish we weren't in this position, and it was really terrible planning, not around the world. It was clear what would happen from about early January on, and who took the right precautions. Only a very few countries in Asia that we should have learnt from in January, February, and not worried really about the responses that weren't being put together properly in America and the UK and Europe.
Bill, we're going to wrap it up there. It's been so enlightening having a chat with you. I do need to ask, though, it's the ad man in me. Whenever we post any of our work, we get some pretty crude and weird comments from our work. Back to the HIV/AIDS ad that you did, the Grim Reaper. Was there anything that surprised you in the commentary?
There was. I think it went to air on the Sunday night in April, and I was back in the office, and I often used to take calls from the public just to see what they were saying and how things were going. And I got back to the office, I think, on the Wednesday and picked up the phone, the commander phone in those days. And he said, "Hey, it's Paul Chappell here." And I said, "Oh, Mr. Chappell, how are you?" And he said, "Look, I'm the president of the 10-Pin Bowling Operators Association of Australia, and you've got to take that ad off the air." And I thought, "Oh, really? Look, why would that be, Mr. Chappell?" And he said, "Mate, what you're showing that if you put your fingers in the bowling ball, you're going to get AIDS." He said, "It will ruin our business. There'll be nothing left, and we'll come after you for compensation." And I've got to say, part of the job was trying to do a risk analysis of every possible thing that could happen. I thought we'd done about
think of the bowling balls.
But bowling balls would give you AIDS was something that, even though the Grim Reaper was bowling the bowling ball, it had never occurred to me that you could get it by sticking your fingers in the bowling ball.
And then of course you'll transfer it to the hot dog and the popcorn, and all hell breaks loose.
Yes, well, it was there weren't many funny stories in AIDS, but that was a very funny one.
I'm sure. Well, thank you for sharing that one. But Bill, thank you on behalf of all of us here at the Check-In. We would like to thank you for being part of our first show, and your great insights and knowledge. It's fantastic to have that as part of the national conversation that we're having, and hopefully people watching would have got something new out of what you've mentioned. So thank you very much for being part of the show.
Well, thanks so much, and very good luck to you. And I'll tune in next time.
Thanks. That'll be Tuesday night.
Tuesday night. Great.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
So that is Bill Bowtell. Thanks so much for being part of the first show, Bill. It's been fantastic, and a lot of great comments, and a lot of big thanks from the audience as well. So that's episode 1. So we're at the end. Thank you for watching. For those of you who are still with us, 47 minutes later. I was trying to get this show down to 20 minutes, but hey, it's a good conversation. And where are you going to go anyway? It's kind of like just a massive staycation at the moment at a really bad venue. But anyway, I hope you're coping okay. I do want to leave the show today with a comment from Stephen Colbert, who I think summed it up beautifully. The last 2 weeks have been a strange 10 years. That's it for now. Thank you very much for being a part of the first show. We're back again on Tuesday night, and we'll be interviewing Clayton Jacobson, Australian filmmaker and director. And we'll be talking to Clay about the film industry and getting a sneak peek in terms of what he's doing in his home in Victoria. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Bye for now.